Hi, I'm Natalie. I thought doctors were healers, protectors, people who took an oath to do no harm. Instead, on the morning of my gallbladder surgery, I discovered a document that shattered everything I believed about the medical system. What I found wasn't just medical records, it was evidence of a conspiracy that had been growing in the shadows of my pain for months. And when I tried to expose the truth, they tried to silence me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the pre-surgery waiting area cast everything in a sickly pale glow, making the beige walls look even more lifeless than usual. Cedar Falls, Michigan had one of those late October mornings where the chill crept through the hospital's drafty windows, settling into your bones like an unwelcome guest. I sat in the stiff plastic chair, wearing the thin cotton gown that made me feel more exposed than protected, clutching a manila folder that would change everything. My name is Natalie Rodriguez, and I was about to undergo what should have been a routine gallbladder removal at Lakewood Medical Center. For 6 months, I'd been living with stabbing pains that would double me over without warning, sending me to the emergency room 3 different times. Each visit, Dr. Harrison Webb assured me that surgery was the only solution, that my gallbladder was severely diseased and needed to come out immediately. The folder in my hands contained my insurance pre-authorization paperwork, something I'd requested the night before out of pure anxiety. I wanted to understand every detail of what was happening to my body, every procedure they planned to perform. As someone who worked in accounting, I had a habit of reading the fine print, of wanting to see the numbers add up correctly. This time, that habit would save my life. I opened the folder with trembling fingers, expecting to find standard surgical consent forms and billing codes. Instead, the first document made my blood run cold. It was Dr. Webb's initial assessment report, dated 3 months earlier than what he'd told me. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what the report actually said. Patient presents with mild gastritis and anxiety-related digestive symptoms. Gallbladder function appears normal on ultrasound. Recommend dietary modifications and stress management. Surgery not indicated at this time. I read the words again, my hands shaking so violently that the paper rustled like autumn leaves. Normal gallbladder function. Surgery not indicated. The complete opposite of everything Dr. Webb had been telling me for months. I flipped through more pages, finding a second opinion report from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a gastroenterologist I'd never heard of, dated just 2 weeks after Webb's initial assessment. Consulted on Rodriguez's case, patient symptoms consistent with stress-induced gastritis. Gallbladder shows no signs of inflammation or dysfunction. Surgical intervention contraindicated and potentially harmful. Recommend conservative treatment protocol. My vision blurred as the magnitude of what I was reading sank in. Dr. Webb hadn't just been wrong about my diagnosis. He had actively ignored a specialist's recommendation against surgery. He had lied to me, repeatedly for months. But why? I kept reading, my stomach churning with a different kind of sickness now. The next document was a billing projection, and the numbers made me gasp out loud. The surgery I was scheduled for in less than 2 hours was projected to cost my insurance company over $47,000. $47,000 for a procedure that multiple doctors had deemed unnecessary. But it got worse. Much worse. Attached to the billing projection was an email thread between Dr. Webb and someone named Patricia Mills from the hospital's administrative office. The subject line read, Q4 Surgical Volume Targets. As I read the exchange, my hands grew cold despite the hospital's stifling heat. Harrison, we're still short on our quarterly surgical revenue goals. The board is asking questions about your department's productivity metrics. We need to see an uptick in procedures before the end of November, or we'll be looking at budget cuts. Dr. Webb's response was clinical in its callousness. Have identified several candidates for gallbladder removals. Insurance pre-approvals pending. Should easily hit targets with current patient load. Several candidates. Current patient load. They were talking about human beings like we were line items on a spreadsheet, like our bodies were inventory to be moved. I thought about the other patients I'd seen in Dr. Webb's waiting room over the past few months. All of us clutching our sides. All of us trusting that our pain meant something was seriously wrong. A nurse walked by, her soft-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. She glanced at me with professional concern, probably wondering why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I managed a weak smile and pretended to adjust my hospital gown, hiding the documents against my chest. My mind raced through the past 6 months, reframing every interaction I'd had with Dr. Webb through this new horrible lens. The way he'd dismissed my questions about alternative treatments. How he'd scheduled my surgery so quickly after my first visit, barely giving me time to think. The pressure he'd put on me to proceed, telling me that waiting could be dangerous, that my condition was progressive and would only get worse. It was all lies. Calculated, deliberate lies designed to get me onto an operating table I never should have been near. I remembered the way he'd looked at me during our last consultation. His eyes cold and distant despite his practiced bedside manner. "Natalie, I've been doing this for 15 years, he'd said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Trust me when I tell you that this surgery is not just recommended, it's necessary. Your quality of life will only deteriorate if we don't act soon." Quality of life. He'd used those exact words while planning to destroy mine for the sake of his surgical quota. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, though that cut deep enough. The worst part was realizing how close I'd come to letting them do it. In less than 2 hours, I would have been unconscious on a table while Dr. Webb removed a perfectly healthy organ from my body, collecting his fee while potentially causing complications that could last the rest of my life. I thought about my friend Carla, who owned the coffee shop downtown where I went every morning before work. She'd been so supportive through my health struggles, always asking how I was feeling, bringing me herbal teas that were supposed to help with digestion. Just last week, she'd offered to drive me to the hospital and stay with me during recovery. "Nobody should go through surgery alone," she'd said, squeezing my hand across the small table by her shop's front window. Carla would be here soon, expecting to hold my hand and comfort me through what we both thought was a necessary medical procedure. Instead, she'd find me unraveling the threads of a conspiracy I'd stumbled into by accident. A second nurse approached, checking her clipboard. "Natalie Rodriguez? We'll be taking you back in about 30 minutes. How are you feeling? Any last-minute questions or concerns?" I looked up at her kind face, wondering how many people at Lakewood Medical Center were part of this, and how many were simply doing their jobs, unaware that patients were being funneled into unnecessary surgeries, like cattle through a chute. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I do have some concerns. Could I speak with Dr. Webb before the procedure?" The nurse nodded. "Of course. Let me see if I can get him down here for a few minutes." As she walked away, I carefully reorganized the documents in my folder, making sure I understood exactly what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about me anymore. The email mentioned other candidates, other patients who might be facing the same deception. People who trusted their doctor, who believed that the medical system existed to help them, not exploit them. I thought about my mother, who'd raised me to respect authority figures, to trust professionals, to never question people who knew more than I did. She would have gone through with this surgery without hesitation, grateful that a skilled doctor was willing to help her. The idea that she could have been similarly betrayed made my chest tighten with protective fury. The folder felt heavier in my hands now, weighted with the responsibility of what I'd discovered. I wasn't just holding my medical records anymore. I was holding evidence of systematic fraud, proof that patients were being treated as profit centers rather than human beings in need of care.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Outside the waiting room windows, Cedar Falls looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Traffic moved normally along Maple Street, people headed to work, to school, to appointments, all of them trusting that the institutions in their community existed to serve them. None of them knowing that inside this unremarkable brick building, doctors were making decisions based on quarterly revenue targets rather than medical necessity. My phone buzzed with a text from Carla. "On my way with your favorite chamomile tea. You've got this, girl. See you soon." I stared at the message, tears blurring my vision. Carla thought she was coming to support me through a legitimate medical crisis. Instead, she'd arrived to find me in the middle of the biggest fight of my life. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. Someone who cared about me, someone who would listen when I explained what I'd discovered, someone who would help me figure out what to do next. Because one thing was absolutely certain. I was not getting on that operating table. Not today, not ever, not for a surgery that existed solely to pad Dr. Webb's statistics and Lakewood Medical Center's bottom line. The question was, what came next? How do you confront a system that's designed to silence patients, to make us feel grateful for procedures we never needed, to convince us that questioning medical authority is dangerous and foolish? I didn't have answers yet, but I had something more powerful: the truth. And the truth had a way of spreading, of finding cracks in even the most carefully constructed lies. Dr. Webb and his administrative partners had made one crucial mistake. They'd put their conspiracy in writing, and they'd given that writing to the wrong person. A person who knew how to read financial documents, who understood the difference between medical necessity and profit motivation, who had been raised by a mother who taught her that standing up for what's right was more important than being polite or comfortable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting their harsh glow across the waiting room, full of vulnerable people in hospital gowns. Some of them might be here for legitimate procedures, but others could be just like me, victims of a system that saw their bodies as opportunities rather than sacred trusts. I closed my eyes for a moment, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside myself, from the part of me that had always known something felt wrong about Dr. Webb's rushed timeline and dismissive attitude toward my questions. When I opened them again, I saw Dr. Webb himself walking toward me, his white coat pristine, his smile practiced and reassuring. He had no idea that everything was about to change, that the scared, compliant patient he expected to find was gone, replaced by someone who knew exactly what he'd been planning to do to her. Someone who had evidence, who had names and dates and dollar amounts, who was no longer willing to trust blindly. "Good morning, Natalie," he said, settling into the chair next to mine with practiced ease. "I understand you had some questions before we get started. That's perfectly normal. A lot of patients experience pre-surgical anxiety. Pre-surgical anxiety." He was already dismissing my concerns before I'd even voiced them, already categorizing my questions as emotional rather than rational. It was a pattern I could now see clearly, part of a larger system designed to keep patients passive and uninformed. I looked directly into his eyes, the folder heavy on my lap, the weight of truth settling into my bones like armor. "Actually, Dr. Webb, I think there's been a mistake. A very serious mistake." His smile faltered slightly, just for a second, but I caught it. The first crack in his professional facade. He had no idea what I'd discovered, but some instinct was warning him that this conversation wasn't going to go according to his script. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice still smooth but with a slight edge that hadn't been there before. I opened the folder, revealing the documents that would change everything. The kind that's about to end your career. Dr. Webb's face went through a series of micro-expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then something much colder. His practiced smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the kind of calculating look I'd seen on salespeople when their pitch wasn't working. "Natalie, I'm not sure what you think you've found, but sometimes medical documents can be confusing for patients without proper training to interpret them." His voice had shifted from warm bedside manner to condescending professor. "Why don't we discuss this after your procedure? Right now we need to focus on getting you the care you need." I held up the first page, the one with Dr. Vasquez's assessment clearly stating that surgery was contraindicated. Is Dr. Elena Vasquez confused too? Because according to her report, my gallbladder is functioning normally and surgery could be harmful. Dr. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached for the document, but I pulled it back against my chest. "May I see the full file? Sometimes documents get misfiled, and I want to make sure we're looking at the correct patient information." The audacity was breathtaking. He was suggesting that somehow the wrong patient's documents had ended up in my insurance folder. Documents that clearly had my name, date of birth, and social security number on every page. But what struck me most was his immediate instinct to gasoline, to find an explanation that would preserve his narrative, rather than address the content of what I'd discovered. "These are definitely my documents, Dr. Webb. My name is on every page. My insurance ID number matches the card in my wallet. And according to your own initial assessment, my gallbladder showed normal function on the ultrasound you ordered. A woman in scrubs approached us, checking her watch. Dr. Webb, we're ready for Mrs. Rodriguez in OR 3. Give us a few more minutes, he said without looking at her. His eyes stayed fixed on me, studying my face like he was trying to solve a particularly complex equation. When the nurse walked away, he leaned forward slightly. Natalie, I understand your anxiety, but you need to trust that I have your best interests at heart. Medical decisions are complex, and sometimes what appears contradictory in paperwork makes sense when you understand the full clinical picture. I almost laughed. The full clinical picture. As if I hadn't spent the last 20 minutes reading email exchanges about surgical volume targets and quarterly revenue goals. As if his concern for my well-being wasn't thoroughly documented as concern for his department's productivity metrics. Then explain the email from Patricia Mills about meeting surgical quotas. I said quietly, explain how I became a candidate for gallbladder removal to help your department hit its revenue targets. The color drained from Dr. Webb's face so quickly I thought he might faint right there in the pre-surgical waiting area. His mouth opened and closed twice before any words came out, and when they did, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. I don't know what you think you've seen, but patient records are confidential and complex. You're clearly experiencing significant anxiety, which is affecting your judgment. Perhaps we should discuss a mild sedative to help you relax before the procedure. A sedative. He wanted to drug me into compliance, to make me too drowsy to ask questions or cause problems. The suggestion sent ice through my veins, not because I was afraid of sedation, but because of how easily he'd shifted to viewing me as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a patient to be healed. I'm not anxious, Dr. Webb. I'm informed. And I'm not consenting to this surgery. The words came out steadier than I felt inside. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my voice remained calm, clear, unshakable. I watched his face cycle through surprise, frustration, and finally, something that looked dangerously close to anger. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something. Your condition is serious. If you delay this surgery, you could face life-threatening complications. I've seen patients die from ruptured gallbladders because they refused treatment. He was trying to scare me into compliance, using the threat of death to override my objections. But I'd read his actual assessment. My gallbladder wasn't diseased. There was no rupture risk. He was fabricating a medical emergency that didn't exist. According to your own initial report, there's no disease present to cause complications. According to Dr. Vasquez, surgery could cause harm. So which version is true, doctor? Quote, Dr. Webb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Several other patients looked over, sensing the tension that had built between us. He lowered his voice, but the controlled fury was unmistakable. You're making a serious mistake, Natalie. Medical decisions should be left to medical professionals. Patients who try to self-diagnose using incomplete information often face tragic consequences. There was something almost threatening in his tone now, a subtle implication that refusing his recommendation would lead to disaster. But I'd seen his emails. I knew his motivations. The only tragic consequence would be an unnecessary surgery performed for profit. I want to speak with Dr. Vasquez, I said, the gastroenterologist who recommended against surgery. I'd like her current opinion on my case. Dr. Vasquez is no longer with our hospital system, Dr. Webb replied quickly, too quickly. She transferred to a facility in Detroit last month. I made a mental note to verify that claim later. If Dr. Vasquez had been forced out after recommending against profitable surgeries, that would be another piece of the puzzle, another thread in a conspiracy that was looking larger and more systematic than I'd initially realized. Then I want a second opinion from another gastroenterologist, someone not affiliated with Lakewood Medical Center. Dr. Webb's composure cracked further. Mrs. Rodriguez, you're scheduled for surgery in less than an hour. Operating rooms are booked weeks in advance. If you cancel now, we may not be able to reschedule for months. Your condition could deteriorate significantly in that time. Months. He was suggesting it would take months to get another surgical slot, creating artificial urgency to pressure me into proceeding. But if my condition was truly emergent, Wouldn't any competent hospital be able to accommodate an urgent case? The timeline manipulation was just another layer of coercion. If my condition is so serious that waiting months could be dangerous, then surely any hospital would prioritize me for emergency surgery. But according to the medical evidence in this folder, there's no emergency at all. A security guard had appeared near the nurse's station, not approaching directly but positioning himself where he could observe our conversation. I wondered if Dr. Webb had signaled for backup, or if the raised voices had triggered standard protocol for managing difficult patients. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider. This surgery will improve your quality of life significantly. The symptoms you've been experiencing will only get worse without intervention. Quality of life. The same phrase from his consultation notes, the same manipulation tactic he'd used to convince me initially. But now I understood it differently. My quality of life would indeed be impacted by surgery, but not in the way he'd suggested. Unnecessary surgery carried risks of complications, infections, chronic pain, digestive issues that could last forever. He was offering to solve a problem I didn't have by creating new problems I'd live with for the rest of my life. My quality of life will be significantly better without unnecessary surgery, I replied. I'm refusing this procedure, and I'm leaving. I stood, clutching the folder against my chest like a shield. Dr. Webb stepped closer, his professional mask completely abandoned now. If you walk out of here against medical advice, I won't be responsible for what happens to you. When you're back in the emergency room next week with a ruptured gallbladder, don't expect me to save your life. The threat was crystal clear. He was telling me that if I refused to be a compliant victim of his fraud, he'd refuse to treat me if I ever needed genuine emergency care. It was medical blackmail, an abuse of the power differential between doctor and patient. I'll take that risk, I said, moving toward the exit. But I think we both know there won't be any ruptured gallbladder, because there's nothing wrong with mine. Wait. His voice stopped me at the doorway. When I turned back, his expression had shifted again, this time to something that might have been desperation. Natalie, please, sit down. Let's talk about this rationally. Rationally. As if refusing unnecessary surgery was irrational. As if questioning a doctor who'd been caught lying in official documents was somehow unreasonable. But there was something in his tone that made me pause, a crack in his authority that revealed genuine fear underneath. I'm listening, I said, but I didn't sit down. I wanted to be able to leave quickly if needed. You're right that there are some inconsistencies in your file. Sometimes, in a busy hospital, communication between departments isn't perfect. But that doesn't mean you don't need treatment. Your symptoms are real. Your pain is real. I want to help you. He was walking back his position, acknowledging inconsistencies, while trying to maintain the narrative that surgery was still necessary. But his admission that there were problems with my file was significant. It was the first crack in his wall of professional certainty. If you want to help me, then explain why Dr. Vasquez's recommendation against surgery was ignored. Explain why you scheduled a procedure that a specialist said was contraindicated. Dr. Webb glanced around the waiting room, seemingly aware for the first time that our conversation was being observed by other patients, nurses, and staff. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Could we continue this discussion in my office? Privately? Every instinct I had screamed against going anywhere private with him. The last thing I wanted was to be alone in his territory, away from witnesses, where he could escalate his pressure tactics without public scrutiny. No. If you have something to say, you can say it here. His frustration was visible now, the practiced bedside manner completely gone. Fine. Dr. Vasquez was overly conservative in her assessment. Sometimes specialists focus too narrowly on their specific area without considering the full patient picture. I made a clinical judgment that surgery was the best course of action despite her reservations. It was a reasonable-sounding explanation, but it didn't account for the emails about surgical quotas, the pressure from administration to increase procedure volume, or his own initial assessment that found normal gallbladder function. He was giving me a partial truth designed to sound medical and authoritative while concealing the financial motivations I'd discovered. And the emails about meeting surgical targets? How does that factor into your clinical judgment? Dr. Webb went very still. I don't know what emails you're referring to. The lie was so blatant, so easily disprovable that it almost made me laugh. I pulled out the printed email thread and held it where he could see his own name at the bottom of the messages. These emails, the ones where you discuss identifying candidates for gallbladder removals to hit quarterly revenue goals. The ones where Patricia Mills from administration pressures you to increase surgical volume. He stared at the papers for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, completely devoid of humor. You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? You think this is about one doctor making bad decisions. You think you can wave some papers around, and everything will magically get better. There was something almost pitying in his voice now, as if I were a child who'd stumbled into adult problems I couldn't understand. It was more unsettling than his anger had been. Then explain it to me, I said. Help me understand what I'm dealing with. Dr. Webb looked around the waiting room one more time, then back at me. When he spoke again, his voice was tired, defeated in a way that seemed genuine for the first time since our conversation began. Do you know how much medical school costs, Natalie? How much a surgery residency program charges? How much malpractice insurance runs every year? Do you know what happens to doctors who don't meet hospital productivity requirements? I had a feeling I was about to receive an education I'd never wanted. The system doesn't work the way you think it does. Hospitals are businesses first, medical facilities second. They have shareholders, profit margins, quarterly reports, just like any other corporation. Doctors who don't generate sufficient revenue get their privileges revoked, their contracts terminated, their careers destroyed. He was trying to justify medical fraud with financial pressure, as if being in debt gave him the right to perform unnecessary procedures on unsuspecting patients. But despite my anger, I could hear something genuine in his voice, an exhaustion that suggested this conversation was as difficult for him as it was for me. So you decided to solve your financial problems by cutting up people who trusted you? I decided to survive in a system that punishes doctors for practicing conservative medicine. Do you know what happens to physicians who underperform on surgical volume? They get labeled as incompetent. Liability risks, problems to be eliminated. I've seen good doctors destroyed because they wouldn't play the game. And what about the patients? What happens to us when you play the game? Dr. Webb was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I told myself you'd be fine. Gallbladder surgery is routine, low risk. You'd have a few weeks of recovery, some minor discomfort, but no permanent damage. I convinced myself it wasn't really hurting anyone. The admission hung in the air between us like poison gas. He'd known. He'd known the surgery was unnecessary, known he was violating his oath, known he was treating my body like a commodity. But he'd rationalized it as acceptable, because the immediate harm seemed minimal. What about complications? What about surgical infections, chronic pain, digestive problems that could last the rest of my life? The risks are small, he said automatically, then caught himself. Were small. The risks were statistically small. Past tense. He was already talking about my canceled surgery in the past tense, accepting that it wasn't going to happen, but his casual dismissal of surgical risks, even small ones, was telling. He was willing to expose me to any level of risk for the sake of his career preservation, small risks that I never consented to take because I never needed the procedure in the first place. Dr. Webb nodded slowly. You're right. You're absolutely right. The acknowledgement should have felt like victory, but instead it felt hollow. His admission confirmed everything I'd suspected, but it also revealed the scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just about one corrupt doctor. It was about an entire system that incentivized unnecessary procedures, that punished conservative treatment, that turned patients into profit centers. How many others, I asked? How many other patients are scheduled for surgeries they don't need? Dr. Webb's silence was answer enough. I thought about the other people I'd seen in his waiting room. The scared faces, the trust in their eyes as they prepared for procedures they believed were necessary. How many of them were like me, victims of a quota system they didn't even know existed? This has to stop, I said. It won't, Dr. Webb replied. You can report me, get me fired, destroy my career. But the system that created this situation will still be here. Another doctor will take my place, face the same pressures, make the same compromises. Nothing will fundamentally change. His fatalism was almost as infuriating as his initial deception. He was suggesting that medical fraud was inevitable, that patient exploitation was simply the cost of doing business in modern healthcare. But his resignation also revealed something important: fear. He was terrified of what would happen when this got out, and he was trying to discourage me from pursuing it further. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe the system won't change overnight. But it won't change at all if nobody speaks up. I turned toward the exit again, clutching my folder of evidence. Behind me, I heard Dr. Webb call my name one more time. Natalie. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I stopped but didn't turn around. Sorry you got caught, or sorry you were willing to cut me open for money? He didn't answer, and I didn't wait for one. I pushed through the double doors of the surgical wing, leaving behind the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting. Walking into the natural sunlight of a October morning that suddenly felt like the first day of the rest of my life. The automatic doors of Lakewood Medical Center slid shut behind me, sealing off the world where I'd almost become a victim of systematic medical fraud. But as I walked toward my car, the folder of evidence heavy in my hands, I realized that leaving the hospital was just the beginning. Dr. Webb was right about one thing. The system that had created this situation was still intact, still pressuring doctors to prioritize profits over patients, still treating human bodies like inventory to be moved. But he was wrong about something crucial. Change was possible, even if it required more courage than I'd ever needed before, and I was about to find out exactly how much courage I had. The October air hit my face like a splash of cold water, sharp and clean after the recycled hospital atmosphere. I stood on the sidewalk outside Lakewood Medical Center, holding the folder that contained enough evidence to destroy careers and possibly save lives. The parking lot stretched before me, filled with cars belonging to patients who trusted that the people inside that building had their best interests at heart. My phone buzzed with a text from Carla. Running a few minutes late. Traffic on Maple Street is crazy. How are you feeling? How was I feeling? Like I'd just discovered that the medical system I'd trusted my entire life was fundamentally broken. Like I'd narrowly escaped becoming a victim of legalized assault. Like I was holding a hand grenade with the pin already pulled. I texted back quickly. Surgery canceled. Long story. Meet me at your shop instead? Her response came immediately. What? Are you okay? On my way. As I drove through Cedar Falls toward Morning Ground's coffee shop, I tried to process what had just happened. The tree-lined streets looked exactly the same as they had 2 hours ago, but something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world. The trust I'd placed in institutions, in professional authority, in the basic assumption that doctors wanted to heal rather than exploit, had cracked wide open. Carla's coffee shop occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, with wide front windows and mismatched furniture that somehow felt more welcoming than any corporate chain. The morning rush had cleared out, leaving just a few regulars with laptops and the comforting smell of dark roast coffee. When I pushed through the front door, Carla looked up from behind the espresso machine, her face creased with worry. Natalie, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. I settled into our usual spot by the front window, the folder on the small round table between us like evidence at a crime scene. Carla brought over 2 mugs of coffee and sat across from me, her dark eyes studying my face with the intensity of someone who'd known me for 15 years. Tell me everything, she said simply. So I did. I explained about requesting the insurance documents, about discovering the contradictory medical reports, about Dr. Webb's emails discussing surgical quotas and revenue targets. I showed her the evidence, watching her face change as she read through the damning correspondence between the doctor and hospital administration. When I finished, Carla sat back in her chair, running her hands through her short black hair. Jesus, Natalie, they were going to cut you open for money. They were going to remove a healthy organ because it would help them meet their quarterly numbers. Hearing it summarized so starkly made the reality even more horrifying. And according to Dr. Webb, I'm not the only one. He mentioned other candidates, other patients who've been identified for unnecessary procedures. What are you going to do? The question I'd been dreading. What was I going to do? Report Dr. Webb to the state medical board? Contact the police? Call a medical malpractice attorney? All of the above. The scope of what I had uncovered felt overwhelming, like trying to drain a lake with a teacup. I don't know yet. But I can't just pretend this didn't happen. Other people are going to be hurt if nothing changes. Carla nodded, her expression grim. You're right, but you know they're going to fight back, don't you? Hospitals have lawyers, public relations teams, millions of dollars to protect their reputation. They're not going to just roll over because one patient found some inconvenient emails. She was right, and I'd been trying not to think about it. Taking on Lakewood Medical Center would be like David facing Goliath. Except Goliath had corporate lawyers, and I had a folder of documents and righteous indignation. But what was the alternative? Staying quiet while other patients were manipulated into unnecessary surgeries? I have to try, I said, even if they destroy me in the process. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but with a local Cedar Falls area code. I hesitated, then answered. Ms. Rodriguez? This is Patricia Mills from Lakewood Medical Center Administration. I understand there was some confusion about your procedure this morning. The woman from the emails, the one who'd been pressuring Dr. Webb to increase surgical volume to meet quarterly targets. My pulse quickened as I realized the hospital's damage control machine was already spinning into action. There was no confusion, I said carefully. I declined an unnecessary surgery after reviewing my medical records. I see. Well, sometimes patients can misinterpret medical documents without proper clinical context. Dr. Webb is concerned about your well-being and would like to schedule a follow-up consultation to address any concerns you might have. Quote, the patronizing tone was unmistakable. I was being treated like a confused child who'd misunderstood her homework, not a competent adult who'd uncovered evidence of medical fraud. Carla was listening intently, her eyebrows raised at the one-sided conversation she could hear. I won't be scheduling any follow-up appointments with Dr. Webb, I replied. But I would like to discuss those quarterly surgical targets you've been so concerned about. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Patricia Mills spoke again, her voice had lost its false warmth. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Ms. Rodriguez. Perhaps you should speak with someone from our patient advocacy department about any concerns you have. I'm referring to your emails with Dr. Webb about meeting Q4 surgical revenue goals. The ones where you discuss identifying candidates for procedures to boost department productivity metrics. Another long silence. Then, Ms. Rodriguez, I think there may be some misunderstanding about confidential internal communications. Hospital administration routinely discusses operational matters that might seem concerning to patients without proper context. She was trying to normalize it, to make systematic patient exploitation sound like routine business operations. But her nervous energy was coming through the phone clearly. They knew I had evidence, and they were scrambling to contain the damage. I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that patients are being treated like inventory to be moved through your surgical department. I understand that medical decisions are being made based on profit margins instead of clinical need. And I understand that you're hoping I'll just go away quietly. Ms. Rodriguez, I really think you should speak with our legal department before making any unfounded accusations. Sometimes patients who are upset about medical procedures can say things they later regret. The threat was barely veiled. They were warning me that making public accusations could result in legal action against me. But they were also revealing their strategy: intimidation through the legal system, using their resources to silence inconvenient patients. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and hung up. Carla was staring at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. They're already trying to shut you up. Which means they're scared, I replied. If this was really just a misunderstanding, they wouldn't be mobilizing their damage control team 30 minutes after I walked out. My phone immediately started ringing again. This time it was Dr. Webb's number. I declined the call, but it rang again within seconds. Then a text message appeared. Natalie, please call me. We need to discuss this situation before it gets out of hand. Before it gets out of hand. As if systematic medical fraud was perfectly fine, as long as it stayed quiet and manageable. As if my refusal to be a compliant victim was the real problem here. They're panicking, I told Carla, which means what I found is even worse than I thought. Over the next hour, my phone rang continuously. Dr. Webb called 4 more times. Patricia Mills called twice. A number listed as Lakewood Legal Department called once. I ignored them all, but each unanswered call felt like escalation, like pressure building in a system that wasn't designed to handle patient resistance. Carla had closed the shop early and hung a "back in 30 minutes" sign on the door. She sat across from me, helping me organize the documents and take notes as we developed a plan of action. The evidence was damning, but we both knew that having proof and getting anyone to act on it were two different things. "You need to document everything," Carla said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Every phone call, every conversation, every attempt to pressure you back into compliance. If they're going to fight dirty, you need a record of it." She was right. I started writing down the timeline of events, from discovering the documents to my confrontation with Dr. Webb to the phone calls from hospital administration. Each entry revealed a pattern of escalating desperation from people who thought they could manipulate me back into silence. "What about going to the media?" Carla suggested. "Local news stations love stories about patients fighting back against medical corruption." I considered it. Public exposure could be powerful, but it could also backfire spectacularly if the hospital's public relations team managed to frame me as a disgruntled patient making wild accusations. I needed something more solid, more official, more likely to result in actual consequences for the people involved. "I think I need a lawyer first," I said. "Someone who specializes in medical malpractice or healthcare fraud. Someone who knows how to fight institutions like Lakewood." As if summoned by my words, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Rodriguez, my name is Marcus Chen. I'm a medical malpractice attorney here in Cedar Falls. I understand you may have concerns about treatment you received at Lakewood Medical Center. I'd like to discuss your situation if you're interested." Carla and I looked at each other across the small table. "That was fast," she said. "Too fast." How had a local attorney learned about my situation so quickly? Had someone at the hospital reached out to legal contacts, trying to get ahead of potential litigation? Or was this legitimate outreach from someone who genuinely wanted to help? "Could be a setup," I said. "Hospital sends a friendly lawyer to get information about what I know, then uses it against me. Or it could be legitimate. Maybe word is already getting around about what happened this morning." I stared at the text message, trying to decide. Trust had become a complicated concept over the past few hours. The medical professionals I'd been taught to respect had proven themselves willing to exploit my trust for financial gain. Now a lawyer was appearing out of nowhere, offering help I desperately needed but couldn't be certain was genuine. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized as belonging to the Cedar Falls Police Department. My stomach dropped as I answered. "Ms. Rodriguez? This is Officer Jennifer Walsh with Cedar Falls PD. We've received a complaint about some stolen medical documents. We'd like to speak with you about the situation." Stolen documents. They were claiming I'd stolen my own medical records, trying to criminalize my discovery of their fraud. The audacity was breathtaking, but the threat was real. If I could be arrested for possession of my own insurance paperwork, it would discredit everything I'd found and paint me as a criminal rather than a victim. "Those are my medical records," I said carefully, "provided to me by my insurance company for a procedure I was scheduled to undergo." "I understand, ma'am. This is probably just a misunderstanding that we can clear up quickly. Would you be available to come down to the station this afternoon? Just to give your side of the story. Just to give my side of the story." As if there were multiple valid interpretations of whether someone could steal their own medical documents. But refusing to cooperate with police could be seen as suspicious, while going to the station could walk me into a trap designed to discredit my evidence. "I'll need to speak with an attorney first," I said. "That's certainly your right, Ms. Rodriguez. But I want to assure you that this is just a preliminary inquiry. We're not accusing you of anything criminal at this point." At this point, the implication was clear. Cooperation might prevent criminal charges, while resistance could escalate the situation. It was another form of intimidation, using the legal system to pressure me into backing down. After I hung up, Carla looked at me with something approaching fear in her eyes. They're really coming after you hard. Medical fraud allegations this morning, now they're trying to get you arrested for discovering it. The full scope of what I was facing was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one corrupt doctor or one greedy hospital administrator. It was about an entire system that had mechanisms in place to protect itself from exposure, to silence patients who discovered inconvenient truths, to turn victims into criminals if necessary. I need that lawyer, I said, looking at Marcus Chen's text message again. Even if it's a risk, I can't face this alone. I texted back, I'd like to meet. When are you available? The response came within minutes. I can see you this afternoon. My office is at 412 Main Street, Suite 201. How does 3 p.m. work? It was currently just past noon. That gave me a few hours to prepare, to organize my evidence, to steel myself for what was likely to be the most important conversation of my life. But first, I needed to make another phone call. Carla, do you know anyone at the Cedar Falls Gazette, someone in their investigative reporting department? She thought for a moment. My neighbor's daughter works there, Jessica something. She covers local government and business stories. Can you get me her number? If this attorney meeting goes well, I might want to have media backup ready. Quote, as Carla looked up the contact information, I stared out the coffee shop window at the familiar streets of Cedar Falls. This morning, I'd been a trusting patient preparing for routine surgery. Now I was someone who'd uncovered systematic healthcare fraud and was being threatened by the very institutions I'd once respected. The transformation felt surreal, like I'd stepped through a looking glass into a world where healing had been replaced by profit extraction, where patient welfare was secondary to quarterly earnings, where asking questions made you a target rather than an empowered healthcare consumer. But despite the fear, despite the overwhelming odds against me, I felt something I hadn't expected: clarity. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not just for myself, but for every patient who'd been manipulated into unnecessary procedures, every person who'd trusted their doctor only to discover that trust had been weaponized against them. At 2:45 p.m., I walked into the office building at 412 Main Street, carrying my folder of evidence and whatever courage I could muster. The directory in the lobby showed Marcus Chen's office on the second floor, nestled between a tax preparation service and a family counseling practice. The elevator ride to the second floor felt longer than it should have, each second stretching as I prepared for a conversation that could determine whether I'd be able to expose the truth or be destroyed by the system I was challenging. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and copy toner. The door to Suite 201 was glass with gold lettering. Marcus Chen, attorney at law, medical malpractice, and healthcare fraud. I knocked and entered to find a middle-aged Asian man in a dark suit, sitting behind a desk covered with case files and legal documents. He stood as I came in, extending his hand with a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for coming. I know this has been a difficult day for you. As I settled into the chair across from his desk, I realized that this moment would determine everything that came next. Whether I'd find an ally in my fight against systematic healthcare fraud, or whether I'd just walked into another trap set by the people who wanted me silenced. The folder of evidence sat heavy in my lap, containing proof of crimes that could destroy careers and save lives, depending on whether the man across from me was truly on my side or just another part of the machine designed to protect institutional corruption at any cost. Marcus Chen's office was smaller than I'd expected, with law books lining the walls and diplomas arranged precisely behind his desk. The Michigan State Bar certification hung next to what appeared to be awards from medical malpractice organizations. This wasn't some fly-by-night attorney looking for quick settlements. The man sitting across from me had credentials that looked legitimate. Before we begin, Marcus said, pulling out a yellow legal pad, I want you to know that anything you tell me is protected by attorney-client privilege, even if you decide not to retain my services. Feel free to speak openly about your situation. I opened the folder and spread the documents across his desk. His expression remained neutral as he examined Dr. Webb's initial assessment. Dr. Vasquez's contradictory opinion, and the damning email correspondence about surgical quotas. He read each page carefully, occasionally making notes, his face giving away nothing about his thoughts. "Walk me through exactly how you obtained these documents," he said finally. I explained about requesting the insurance pre-authorization file, about opening it in the pre-surgical waiting area, about my confrontation with Dr. Webb. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or jotting down additional notes. "And the hospital has already made contact attempting to recover these documents? They're claiming I stole them. The police want to question me this afternoon." Marcus set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Rodriguez, what you've uncovered here is potentially explosive. This email thread alone could trigger a federal investigation into healthcare fraud. But I need you to understand what you're up against." He stood and moved to the window overlooking Main Street, his hands clasped behind his back. Lakewood Medical Center is owned by Mid-Atlantic Healthcare Systems, a publicly traded corporation with annual revenues exceeding $2 billion. They employ some of the most aggressive legal firms in the country. Their standard response to allegations like this is to destroy the credibility of anyone making accusations. The weight of what he was saying settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd known I was facing institutional power, but the scope of it was larger than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about a local hospital. It was about a massive healthcare corporation, with the resources to crush individual patients who posed a threat to their profit margins. "Are you trying to talk me out of pursuing this?" I asked. Marcus turned back to face me. "I'm trying to make sure you understand the reality of what lies ahead. If we proceed, they will investigate every aspect of your life. They'll look for anything that can be used to paint you as unstable, unreliable, or motivated by something other than legitimate concern for patient safety." "Like what?" "Financial problems that might suggest you're seeking a monetary settlement. Mental health issues that could undermine your credibility as a witness. Personal relationships that might be portrayed as influencing your judgment. They'll hire private investigators, subpoena your employment records, interview your neighbors and coworkers." The invasion of privacy he was describing was staggering. Simply by discovering evidence of medical fraud, I'd opened myself up to having my entire life scrutinized and potentially weaponized against me. But the alternative was allowing other patients to become victims of the same system. What kind of timeline are we looking at if I decide to move forward? That depends on several factors. If we file a civil lawsuit, they'll immediately move to have it dismissed on various technicalities. That process alone could take 6 to 12 months. Meanwhile, they'll be conducting discovery, deposing witnesses, building their defense strategy. Marcus returned to his desk and pulled out a thick folder from his filing cabinet. "I've handled cases against Mid-Atlantic before. Their tactics are predictable but effective. They'll offer you a settlement early in the process, probably a substantial sum with a non-disclosure agreement attached. If you refuse, they escalate the legal pressure until most people give up or run out of money to fight." "What happened in the cases you handled against them?" "Two settled out of court with NDAs, so I can't discuss the details. One went to trial and we lost. The jury believed the hospital's expert witnesses over our medical testimony. The fourth case was dismissed on a technicality related to the statute of limitations. The track record was not encouraging." Marcus was essentially telling me that even with strong evidence and experienced legal representation, the odds of achieving justice were minimal. The system was designed to protect institutional interests over individual patients. "There is another option," Marcus continued. "We could approach this as a whistleblower case rather than traditional malpractice litigation. The False Claims Act allows private citizens to file lawsuits on behalf of the federal government when they discover healthcare fraud that involves Medicare or Medicaid billing." "What's different about that approach?" "Several things. First, if successful, you'd be entitled to a percentage of any money recovered by the government. Second, there are stronger legal protections against retaliation for whistleblowers. Third, the Department of Justice has resources we could never match as private litigants." It sounded promising, but Marcus's expression suggested there were significant downsides as well. "The downside is that whistleblower cases take years to resolve, sometimes decades. The government investigates thoroughly before deciding whether to join the lawsuit. During that time, you'd be living under constant threat of retaliation, both legal and professional." My phone buzzed with another call from the Cedar Falls Police Department. I declined it, but the reminder of the immediate legal pressure was sobering. While we discussed long-term litigation strategies, the hospital was actively working to discredit me through criminal allegations. What about the police situation? They want to question me about allegedly stealing medical records. Marcus's expression hardened. That's intimidation, pure and simple. You have an absolute right to your own medical records. The fact that they're pursuing criminal charges tells me they're desperate to silence you before this information becomes public. Should I talk to them? Not without me present. In fact, let me call Officer Walsh and arrange a meeting at the police station. We'll address their concerns directly and make it clear that you're represented by counsel. As Marcus reached for his phone, I felt some of the weight lift from my shoulders. Having a competent attorney handling the legal maneuvering would allow me to focus on the bigger picture, exposing a system that was exploiting patients for profit. Marcus spoke briefly with Officer Walsh, explaining that he was representing me and requesting that any future contact go through his office. His tone was professional but firm, establishing boundaries without being confrontational. Officer Walsh wants to meet this afternoon at 4 o'clock, he said after hanging up. I'll accompany you to ensure your rights are protected. What do you think they're really after? Information. They want to know what evidence you have, who you've shared it with, what your intentions are regarding publicity or legal action. The criminal allegations are just a pretext for interrogation. Marcus spent the next 30 minutes walking me through the documents in detail, asking specific questions about dates, times, and conversations. He photographed each page with his phone, creating backup copies in case the originals were somehow lost or seized. Natalie, I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for this to become your life for the foreseeable future? Fighting this kind of institutional corruption requires enormous personal sacrifice. Your privacy will be invaded, your character will be attacked, your financial resources will be strained. Many people who start down this path eventually decide the cost is too high. It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding since discovering the documents that morning. Was I prepared to have my life consumed by a legal battle against a billion-dollar corporation? Was I strong enough to withstand the personal attacks and professional retaliation that would inevitably come? What happens to the other patients if I don't fight this? How many people will get unnecessary surgeries because I was too scared to speak up? Marcus nodded slowly. That's the question every whistleblower has to answer for themselves, whether the potential benefit to society justifies the personal cost of exposure. I can't live with myself if I stay quiet. Not when I know what I know. Then we move forward, but we do it strategically, not emotionally. Every step has to be calculated to maximize our chances of success while minimizing your exposure to retaliation. Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a comprehensive strategy. First, we'd handle the police inquiry to eliminate the criminal threat. Then we'd begin documenting additional evidence, including interviews with other patients who might have been subjected to unnecessary procedures. Finally, we'd file a formal whistleblower complaint with the Department of Justice and wait for their investigation to determine the scope of the fraud. I'll need a retainer to officially represent you, Marcus said, sliding a contract across the desk. $5,000 to start, with additional fees depending on how the case develops. $5,000. It was more money than I had readily available, but the alternative was facing a billion-dollar corporation without legal representation. I thought about my savings account, my emergency fund, that I'd built up over years of careful budgeting. I can get you the money by tomorrow morning. Actually, let me propose something different. I'll represent you on a contingency basis for the whistleblower case. If we recover money for the government, I take my fee from your percentage. If we don't recover anything, you don't owe me fees. It was an unexpected offer and one that suggested Marcus believed strongly in the strength of my case. Attorneys don't take cases on contingency unless they're confident about the potential for recovery. Why would you do that? Because cases like this are why I became a medical malpractice attorney. The healthcare system is supposed to heal people, not exploit them. When I see evidence as clear as what you've brought me, I want to see justice done. As we finalized the representation agreement, my phone rang with a call from Carla. Natalie, you need to see the news. Channel 7 is running a story about your situation. Marcus and I looked at each other across his desk. Turn on the TV, I said. Marcus grabbed a remote from his bookshelf and switched on a small television mounted in the corner of his office. The local evening news was just beginning, and the lead story made my stomach drop. Quote, "Good evening, I'm Janet Morrison. Tonight at 5, a Cedar Falls woman faces criminal charges after allegedly stealing confidential medical records from Lakewood Medical Center. The woman, identified as Natalie Rodriguez, disrupted her scheduled surgery this morning and left the hospital with sensitive documents belonging to other patients. They were claiming I'd stolen documents belonging to other people, not just accessed my own medical records. The lie was so blatant, so easily disprovable, that it took my breath away." The news story continued with a statement from Patricia Mills, the hospital administrator I'd spoken with that morning. She appeared professional and concerned, speaking from what looked like an official conference room at Lakewood Medical Center. "Patient privacy is absolutely sacred to us. When someone removes confidential medical information without authorization, it puts all of our patients at risk. We've cooperated fully with law enforcement to ensure this violation is addressed appropriately." Marcus muted the television. "They're controlling the narrative. By the time people hear your version of events, they'll already have formed opinions based on the hospital's accusations. Can we respond? Can we set the record straight? Not yet. Anything we say publicly could compromise our legal strategy. For now, we let them talk while we build our case." It was frustrating to watch myself being portrayed as a criminal on local television while being unable to defend myself or explain what I'd actually discovered. But Marcus was right that premature public statements could backfire if not handled carefully. "The police meeting just became more important," Marcus said. "We need to establish clearly that you accessed only your own medical records, and that the hospital's criminal allegations are unfounded." As we prepared to leave for the police station, Marcus handed me a business card with his contact information. "From this point forward, all communication with anyone connected to this case goes through me. Don't answer calls from reporters, hospital administrators, or anyone else wanting to discuss the situation. If they want information, they can contact my office." Walking out of Marcus's office building, I felt like I was stepping into a different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. This morning, I'd been an anonymous patient preparing for routine surgery. Now I was the subject of criminal allegations being broadcast on local television, represented by an attorney in what could become a years-long legal battle against a billion-dollar healthcare corporation. The stakes had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined when I first opened that insurance folder in the pre-surgical waiting area. But there was no turning back now. The hospital had made it clear they intended to destroy my reputation to protect their own interests. The only way forward was to fight back with the truth, no matter how long it took or what it cost me personally. As Marcus and I drove toward the Cedar Falls police station, I realized that this afternoon's meeting would set the tone for everything that followed. If we could successfully challenge the hospital's criminal allegations, it would demonstrate that their intimidation tactics wouldn't work. If we failed, it would embolden them to escalate their attacks while discrediting me as a witness to their fraud. The police station was a modern brick building that looked more like an office complex than a law enforcement facility. Marcus parked near the front entrance and turned to face me. "Remember, you answer only the questions I approve. If I tell you not to respond to something, stay quiet. They're gonna try to get you to admit to things that could be used against you later." "What kinds of things?" "Accessing computer systems without authorization, removing documents you weren't supposed to have, interfering with hospital operations. All of those could be spun as criminal activity, even if your motivations were legitimate." We walked into the police station together, Marcus carrying his briefcase, and me carrying the folder of evidence that had started everything. The lobby was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lighting and the occasional radio chatter from the dispatch area. Officer Walsh met us at the front desk. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and a professional demeanor that seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile. "Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen, thank you for coming in. We have a conference room where we can discuss this privately." The conference room was sparse but comfortable, with a round table and several chairs. Officer Walsh set a digital recorder on the table and explained that our conversation would be documented for the investigative file. "Ms. Rodriguez, We've received a complaint from Lakewood Medical Center alleging that you removed confidential medical documents without authorization. Can you tell me your version of what happened this morning? Marcus nodded slightly, indicating it was safe to respond. I requested my insurance pre-authorization documents the night before my scheduled surgery. When I reviewed them this morning, I discovered that they contained medical assessments contradicting everything my doctor had told me about my condition. I confronted Dr. Webb about the discrepancies and decided not to proceed with the surgery. And you left the hospital with these documents? I left with my own medical records, yes. Records that my insurance company provided to me for a procedure I was supposed to undergo. Officer Walsh made notes as I spoke. The hospital claims that some of these documents contained information about other patients, making them confidential records you weren't authorized to possess. That's false, Marcus interjected. Every document in my client's possession relates specifically to her care and treatment. We'd be happy to provide copies for your review. Actually, we'd prefer to examine the originals if possible. Marcus and I exchanged glances. Turning over the original documents would leave me without proof of the fraud I'd discovered, potentially allowing the hospital to claim the evidence had been fabricated or altered. We can provide copies for your investigation, Marcus said. The originals need to be preserved for potential federal proceedings related to healthcare fraud allegations. Officer Walsh's eyebrows went up at the mention of federal proceedings. Are you alleging that crimes were committed by hospital staff? We're alleging that my client discovered evidence of systematic healthcare fraud, and that the hospital's response has been to criminalize her access to her own medical records rather than address the underlying issues. The dynamic in the room shifted as Officer Walsh realized she was dealing with more than just a patient dispute. Her questions became more focused, more investigative, as she tried to understand the scope of what I'd uncovered. Ms. Rodriguez, can you describe specifically what led you to believe fraud had occurred? I explained about Dr. Webb's contradictory medical assessments, the email correspondence about surgical quotas, and the specialist's recommendation against surgery that had been ignored. Officer Walsh listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification about dates and details. When I finished, she was quiet for several moments, reviewing her notes. This is obviously more complex than the initial complaint suggested. I'll need to review this information with my supervisor and determine whether criminal charges are appropriate in either direction. Either direction. She was acknowledging that if my allegations were accurate, the hospital staff might be the ones facing criminal liability, not me. How long will that review take? Marcus asked. Probably a few days. In the meantime, Ms. Rodriguez, I'd recommend avoiding any further contact with hospital staff and directing all communications through your attorney. As we left the police station, Marcus looked satisfied with how the meeting had gone. That went better than expected. Officer Walsh seemed genuinely interested in investigating your fraud allegations rather than just pursuing the hospital's criminal complaint. What happens next? We wait for the police to complete their review, continue gathering evidence, and prepare our whistleblower filing with the Department of Justice. This is just the beginning, but it's a good beginning. Driving back toward town as the sun set over Cedar Falls, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in a single day. This morning I'd been a patient trusting my doctor's medical expertise. Tonight I was a whistleblower, represented by an attorney in a potential federal fraud case against $1 billion healthcare corporation. The road ahead would be long, difficult, and uncertain, but for the first time since opening that insurance folder, I felt like I wasn't facing the battle alone. I had legal representation, evidence that could trigger a federal investigation, and most importantly, the knowledge that what I was doing was right, regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the hospital escalated their efforts to discredit me and silence my allegations. But tonight, I'd taken the first crucial step toward exposing a system that treated patients like profit centers, rather than human beings deserving of honest medical care. The truth was finally beginning to fight back. 18 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in Detroit watching as Dr. Harrison Webb was escorted out in handcuffs. The man who had planned to remove my healthy gallbladder for profit was now facing federal charges for healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The victory felt both overwhelming and strangely hollow, like the end of a war that had consumed more of my life than I'd ever expected to sacrifice. The Department of Justice investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond my individual case. Over 300 patients had been subjected to unnecessary procedures at Lakewood Medical Center and 6 other hospitals owned by Mid-Atlantic healthcare systems. The total fraudulent billing exceeded $14 million, money extracted from insurance companies and Medicare through surgeries that ranged from questionable to completely fabricated medical necessity. Marcus Chen stood beside me on the courthouse steps, fielding questions from reporters who had followed the case throughout its lengthy investigation. The morning sun was bright against the stone facade of the federal building, casting sharp shadows that seemed symbolic of how clearly the truth had finally emerged from the institutional darkness that had tried to conceal it. "Ms. Rodriguez, how does it feel to see justice finally served?" a reporter from Channel 7 asked. The same station that had initially portrayed me as a criminal for accessing my own medical records was now treating me as a heroic whistleblower who had exposed systematic healthcare fraud. "It feels like the beginning of accountability, not the end," I replied. This case involved hundreds of patients who trusted their doctors to make medical decisions based on their health needs, not corporate profit margins. The fact that it took 18 months and a federal investigation to achieve basic justice shows how much work we still have to do. The reporter nodded and moved on to questions about the financial settlement. Under the False Claims Act, I was entitled to receive a percentage of the money recovered by the government. My share would be substantial, enough to compensate for the years of legal battles, the professional retaliation I'd faced, and the personal costs of challenging a billion-dollar healthcare corporation. But the money, while welcome, wasn't what had motivated me to persist through the darkest moments of the investigation. When Mid-Atlantic's attorneys had hired private investigators to surveillance my daily activities, when they'd subpoenaed my employment records and questioned my coworkers about my mental stability, when they'd offered me increasingly large settlement amounts in exchange for silence, I'd kept fighting because of the other patients whose stories had emerged during the investigation. Margaret Chen, a 73-year-old grandmother who'd undergone unnecessary cardiac procedures that left her with permanent complications. James Morrison, a construction worker who'd lost his job after recovering from a spinal surgery he'd never needed. Lisa Thompson, a single mother who'd been told her child required emergency appendix removal when the appendix was completely healthy. Each case followed the same pattern I'd discovered in my own situation. Doctors under pressure to meet surgical quotas, identifying vulnerable patients, fabricating or exaggerating medical conditions, and performing procedures that generated revenue while exposing patients to unnecessary risks. The system had turned medicine into a predatory enterprise where human bodies were viewed as profit opportunities. "Natalie, what advice would you give to other patients who suspect they might be victims of unnecessary medical procedures?" another reporter asked. "Trust your instincts," I said. "If something doesn't feel right about a diagnosis or treatment plan, ask questions. Request copies of all your medical records. Get second opinions from doctors who aren't affiliated with the same hospital system. Most importantly, remember that you have the right to refuse any procedure, even if medical professionals pressure you to proceed." As the press conference concluded and reporters dispersed to file their stories, Marcus and I walked toward the parking structure where my car waited. The federal courthouse grew smaller behind us, but the weight of what we'd accomplished felt heavier with each step. "Are you going to keep practicing medical malpractice law?" I asked Marcus as we reached my car. "More than ever," he replied. "This case has shown me that the problems in healthcare are more systematic than I'd realized. There are probably hundreds of other situations like yours happening right now, patients being exploited by systems they trust to heal them." We stood beside my car for a moment, both of us processing the magnitude of what the investigation had revealed. The conspiracy at Mid-Atlantic hadn't been the work of a few corrupt individuals. It had been a coordinated corporate strategy implemented across multiple hospitals, involving administrators, doctors, billing departments, and even some insurance company employees who had been paid to approve questionable procedures without proper review. "What's next for you?" Marcus asked. It was a question I'd been considering throughout the final months of the investigation. My old life in Cedar Falls had become impossible once the case went public. My former employer had terminated my position, claiming budget cuts, though everyone understood it was retaliation for the negative publicity associated with my name. My landlord had refused to renew my lease, citing complaints from other tenants about the media attention and occasional protesters who supported the hospital. But from the destruction of my old life, new possibilities had emerged. Several patient advocacy organizations had offered me consulting positions, wanting my insights into how healthcare fraud operated and how patients could better protect themselves. A medical watchdog group had invited me to serve on their board of directors. Most intriguingly, a publisher had expressed interest in a book about my experience, believing it could help educate other patients about the realities of modern healthcare. I think I want to keep fighting this fight, I told Marcus, but from a different angle. Not just reactive legal cases after the damage is done, but proactive education to help patients avoid becoming victims in the first place. Marcus smiled. That sounds like a perfect next chapter. As I drove out of Detroit that afternoon, heading back towards Cedar Falls to pack up the last remnants of my old life, I reflected on how completely everything had changed since that October morning when I had opened my insurance folder in a pre-surgical waiting room. The naive trust I'd once placed in medical institutions was gone forever, replaced by a more complex understanding of healthcare as an industry where profit motives could override patient welfare. But along with that lost innocence had come something more valuable: the knowledge that individuals could challenge institutional corruption and win, even when the odds seemed impossible. The hundreds of patients whose unnecessary surgeries had been prevented by our investigation would never know my name, but they would benefit from the accountability our case had created. The drive through Michigan's autumn landscape was peaceful, the trees displaying the same gold and crimson colors I'd seen 18 months earlier, when my world had first been turned upside down. But this time, the changing seasons felt like transformation rather than loss, like the end of something that had needed to die so something better could take its place. When I reached Cedar Falls, I stopped first at Morning Ground's coffee shop. Carla was behind the counter as always, her face lighting up when she saw me walk through the door. "Natalie, I saw the news coverage this morning. Congratulations on the conviction." We hugged across the counter, and I felt the warmth of genuine friendship, the kind of relationship that had sustained me through the darkest moments of the legal battle. Carla had never wavered in her support, even when supporting me meant losing some customers who believed the hospital's initial portrayal of me as a disturbed patient making false accusations. "It's finally over," I said, settling into our usual spot by the front window. "No, it's not," Carla replied, bringing over 2 mugs of coffee. "It's just beginning. You've opened a door that other people can walk through now. You've shown that patients don't have to accept whatever doctors tell them without question." She was right, and I could already see evidence of it. During the investigation, dozens of patients had come forward with their own stories of questionable medical procedures, suspicious diagnoses, and pressure tactics designed to rush them into surgery. Support groups had formed online, sharing information about how to research doctors, verify medical necessity, and advocate for conservative treatment approaches. "What are you going to do now?" Carla asked. I told her about the various opportunities I was considering, the chance to transform my experience into something that could help protect other patients from similar exploitation. As we talked, I realized how much stronger I'd become over the past 18 months, how the girl who had once been too intimidated to question medical authority had evolved into someone comfortable challenging institutional power when necessary. That evening, I drove past Lakewood Medical Center for what I knew would be the last time. The building looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing now that I understood the human beings inside were fallible, sometimes corrupt, and always subject to the same accountability as everyone else. Several of the doctors involved in the fraud had been terminated or had their medical licenses suspended. Dr. Webb faced potential prison time. Patricia Mills, the administrator who had pressured doctors to increase surgical volume, had been banned from working in healthcare management. The hospital itself had been sold to a different healthcare corporation that had pledged to implement stronger oversight mechanisms and prioritize patient welfare over profit margins. Whether those promises would be kept remained to be seen, but at least the specific system that had nearly made me a victim had been dismantled. My apartment was mostly empty now, boxes stacked near the door containing the few belongings I planned to keep. Most of my furniture would go to charity, along with the clothes and household items that belonged to the person I'd been before discovering that insurance folder. Starting over felt appropriate after such a complete transformation of my understanding of the world. As I sealed the last box, my phone rang with a call from Janet Kim, the nurse from Lakewood who had eventually become a key witness in the federal investigation. She had been placed in administrative leave early in the case but had been reinstated once her testimony helped establish the pattern of fraud that extended throughout the hospital system. "Natalie, I wanted to call before you left town. I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Janet. You're the one who had the courage to testify about what you witnessed. I never would have spoken up if you hadn't gone first. I saw what was happening, but I was scared of losing my job. Scared of being blacklisted from other hospitals. When you refused to back down, even when they were trying to destroy your reputation, it gave me the strength to do the right thing." Her words touched something deep inside me, a validation that the personal costs I'd endured had served a larger purpose. Healthcare professionals like Janet were the real heroes of this story, the people who witnessed wrongdoing from inside the system and found the courage to expose it despite the professional risks. "What happens now at Lakewood?" I asked. "Complete overhaul. New administration, new oversight protocols, mandatory second opinions for all non-emergency surgical procedures. It's not perfect, but it's so much better than what we had before." After we hung up, I sat in my empty apartment as the sun set over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows through the windows. In a few hours, I would drive to Chicago to begin a new job with the American Patient Advocacy Foundation, an organization dedicated to educating healthcare consumers about their rights and helping them navigate complex medical decisions. The work would be challenging, requiring me to travel frequently, speak at conferences, and relive the trauma of my experience over and over as I helped other patients who found themselves in similar situations. But it felt like the logical next step in a journey that had begun with discovering I was about to undergo unnecessary surgery. My phone buzzed with a text message from someone I didn't recognize. "Ms. Rodriguez, my name is Michael Stevens. I read about your case in the newspaper. I think my mother may have been a victim of unnecessary surgery at a hospital in Wisconsin. Could you help me figure out how to investigate?" It was the first of what would become hundreds of similar messages over the following years. Patients and family members who suspected they had been exploited by healthcare systems, but didn't know how to seek accountability. Each message reminded me that while our case had achieved justice for the specific victims at Mid-Atlantic healthcare systems, the broader problems in healthcare remained largely unchanged. Insurance companies still prioritized cost containment over patient outcomes. Hospitals still measured physician performance using productivity metrics that could incentivize unnecessary procedures. Medical schools still trained doctors to be authority figures, rather than collaborative partners in patient care. Pharmaceutical companies still marketed treatments based on profit potential rather than comparative effectiveness. But change was possible, as our case had demonstrated. When patients were educated about their rights, when they asked questions and demanded evidence, when they refused to be passive recipients of whatever treatment was recommended, the system was forced to respond with greater honesty and accountability. As I carried my boxes out to the car for the final time, I thought about all the patients who would never know that their surgeries had been canceled, their procedures had been questioned, their medical records had been reviewed more carefully, because healthcare providers knew that someone was watching, someone was willing to fight back when necessary. The girl who had walked into Lakewood Medical Center 18 months ago, trusting that her doctor had her best interests at heart, was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that healthcare was an industry like any other, capable of both healing and harm, deserving of respect when it served patients well, and accountability when it prioritized profits over people. The road ahead would bring new challenges as I worked to help other patients navigate the complex realities of modern medicine. But I was no longer naive about the obstacles we faced or the importance of the work we were doing. Every patient who asked questions, demanded second opinions, or refused unnecessary procedures was striking a blow for the kind of healthcare system we all deserved, one where medical decisions were made based on evidence and compassion rather than corporate profit margins. As I drove out of Cedar Falls for the last time, the rearview mirror reflecting a town that had been transformed by our fight for accountability, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the naive hope I'd once placed in institutional authority, but the informed hope that comes from understanding how systems work and how they can be changed when enough people demand better. The sun was setting behind me as I headed toward Chicago, and whatever challenges awaited in my new role as a patient advocate. But ahead of me, the horizon was bright with possibility, illuminated by the knowledge that truth could prevail over deception, that individuals could challenge institutional power, and that the fight for honest healthcare was worth whatever personal costs it required. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones that save people you'll never meet, in ways they'll never know. Sometimes standing up for yourself becomes standing up for everyone who faces the same system, the same pressures, the same choice between accepting what you're told and fighting for what's right. And sometimes, when you refuse to be a victim, you become something much more powerful, someone who ensures that others won't have to be victims either. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.